Speaker series. So I'm going to introduce Jeff Conlon, a PhD student in our program, to introduce our speaker. I'll clap for you.
Jeff Conlon, PhD candidate, College of Communications. So I'm thrilled to introduce this evening's speaker, whose lecture will take us to the intersection of science information and online news environments and help us better understand related vexing issues, such as why does identical scientific information hold different meanings for different audiences? What are the effects of novel news environments on science and scientists? And why is civil debate of controversial issues with each other so hard? Our speaker, of course, is Dr. Sarah Yo, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah. And broadly, her research interests include science and risk communication with a focus on information seeking and processing, emotion, and humor. Dr. Yo's work has been published in numerous science, risk, and communication journals such as Public Understanding of Science, Risk Analysis, Journalism, and Mass Communication Quarterly, and Materials Today. She received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is trained as a bench and field scientist with a Master's of Science degree in oceanography. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Sarah Yo.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Just thank you for the invitation. It's really exciting to be here. I had a moment where I was going to say go Badgers, but no, this is not the spot to do that. Thank you, Jeff, for the wonderful introduction. As he mentioned, I'm Sarah Yo, and oh, well done. Like my last name is rarely pronounced correctly, so Jeff's done a stellar job. But so I'll just briefly give you kind of an outline of where we're going with this talk. Some of my background as to how I got here. I have kind of a unique route to communication as a discipline. I started out as a bench and field scientist, and then kind of went over to the dark side, right? And then I'd like to, sorry, no, it's fine. Just keep going back. Okay, better? Yes? Okay, great. Yeah, so some background and then articulating sort of why science communication is important, especially kind of now in this media environment that we have. Give you a couple of examples of research that I've been doing more recently, some stuff undiscussed in the microbiomes in collaboration with the American Society for Microbiology, and then some of the humor work that's kind of new to me that I recently got an NSF funding to do, which I'm really excited about. In closing, talking a little bit more about the future work that I'm hoping to do, and then some challenges I think that science communication faces. So a little bit to start about my background. I am not from the US, though I am now a naturalized citizen. I grew up in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, where if you've seen Crazy Rich Asians, technically it's set in Singapore, but most of it was filmed in Malaysia, and the lead actor is Malaysian. Just saying. But I went to high school there and actually came to the United States for college. I lived in Honolulu for about 8 years. I got a bachelor's degree in oceanography. I have a minor in chemistry as an undergraduate. I thought I was going to be a chemical oceanographer. I was going to study how carbon cycling happened in the world's oceans. But it turns out I'm actually a microbial oceanographer, so I studied bacteria, a lot of time in the field and a lot of time in the lab, kind of sequencing DNA and filtering water is really what that means. And then I went to the University of Wisconsin to continue on and get a PhD in environmental engineering. So I was an environmental engineering student for a while, PhD student, and I was studying bogs in northern Wisconsin, which obviously from Hawaii you go to Wisconsin, which is a little different from the ocean. But while I was there, I was doing a lot of science communication and engagement work, public outreach type work. And I couldn't quite understand why nobody thought microbes were as cool or as interesting as I did, right? And so I got really interested in this idea of science communication and engagement. I took a course with Sharon Dunwoody, actually, who I understand was here last year. And that actually changed the trajectory of my graduate studies, and I ended up in a smaller department in life sciences communication, where I got a master's, and then eventually got my PhD in mass communication, thinking about how we select our own science, right? Thinking about how people go online and choose science and how the traits that make us who we are influence that. And so my kind of circuitous route to communication has resulted in this sort of areas that I study and in what I teach. So I think a lot about public opinion and public opinion dynamics, thinking about how messages in media, right, have some effects on audiences. And thinking then again about selective exposure, how we choose to pick which comes from social psychology, right, in terms of thinking about avoidance and confirmation bias, things like that, and then how we process that information, right, to ultimately form the attitudes and the behavioral intentions that we have. And a lot of my dissertation work, I think, is on what we might term cognitive heuristics, right? But I've recently sort of moved a little bit more toward emotion and gotten very interested in emotion. Part of that is I met Jess a couple of years ago and we started this project. It was really interesting. And so to kind of articulate a little bit why science communication is important, at least for now, I think what we see now, if we look at some data just in the US, so my study contexts are typically in the US, but in the US you can look at the opinions of adults, right, general publics in the US compared to the experts in science, right? And there's some caveats with this particular sample of AAAS scientists. AAAS is the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's the largest professional science organization in the US. And it's made up not just of scientists, right, but people who are interested in science communication and public engagement. Kind of has a lot of diversity of people in the sciences. But by and large, a lot of them are scientists, right, and experts in some areas. But if we look at the percentage of adults in the United States, again, general audiences, compared to the percentage of AAAS scientists who agree with some of these things about scientific issues that are relevant in society, we see these very large gaps, right? So here, for example, 37% of US adults think it's safe to eat genetically modified foods, right? It's a little dated, these data are from 2015, but 88% of scientists think it's safe. And we see these gaps in other issues as well, right? Evolution, vaccines. Vaccines in particular have very real world repercussions, right? So if you have a small child, don't go to Disneyland, for example. Measles, right? There's no vaccines. And then also in climate, which is really not that surprising, right? And then energy as well. And so we have these sort of large gaps in opinion between publics in the United States, right? And scientists and experts. And there are, a couple of reasons we could articulate for that, right? One of those is, well, in general, we as people, we as citizens are not that good, right, in terms of factual knowledge of science. It's okay. We get 5 out of 9 true-false questions correct, right? So these are data from the National Science Board. It's collected every 2 years. And if you're thinking, well, this is the majority, remember that half of 9 is 4.5, and in true-false questions, you have 50% chance of getting the answer correct. We also have pretty limited frameworks to understand and kind of make sense of new bits of scientific information, right? Again, if you're kind of an optimist, glass half full here, 51% of us, general US adults, can describe what an experiment is, right? The next statistic is not as exciting, right? It's not as positive. Only 23% of us understand the concept of scientific inquiry, this idea of having control conditions, right, when you're running experiments, independent variables, dependent variables, those kinds of things. And we're really distracted, right? Relatively few adult Americans, follow science and technology news very closely. And we can see this mirrored in trends in journalism, right? We see a lot of science specialists in journalism kind of, we no longer have those. In fact, most of our journalists are generalists, right? We're just very distracted most of the time. Because we can choose to never think about science or public affairs or politics, and nobody is listening to me because cats, right? And obviously cats aren't the only thing. There's Justin Bieber, there's Kim Kardashian. Why would we pick science, right, over all these things? So that's one trend. In general, our factual knowledge of science is rather limited. We're pretty distracted, right? We also, on sort of another thread, we tend to learn a lot of science outside the classroom, right? So this is a figure from some informal science education researchers, and it represents the lifespan of the average American. So we have years on the x-axis, we have the time of day on the y, and then on the z going back there, we have months of the year. Right? The box itself represents average lifespan. And you can see how much time we spend in formal education. Right? And into that, there are little drops of science education. It's just a very small proportion of our formal education is science education. Right? I think the stat is 30% of undergraduates will ever take one course in the sciences. Right? And so even more so, these frameworks that we have for understanding science and new scientific information are very limited. And so all the rest of the space is filled by media. A lot of it is filled by media. Sure, there are opportunities in terms of museums, right, and public engagement events, but those are things that, you know, science interested and science curious folk opt to go to, right? There's also media. And what we see in media is quite different from what it used to be. Right? Some of us in the room will remember broadcast era media, where 3 channels, generally the same, covered kind of similar topics of the day, right? Even if those science topics, politics, and a lot of us had a lot of inadvertent exposure to this. We were maybe waiting for the entertainment program that came on after the news, and so the TV was on, right? And so we had some inadvertent exposure. Now, I think we have fewer shared experiences with media because we have so many more options, right? Again, you could choose to watch cat GIFs. There's this GIF thing, right? But you could choose to watch that all the time, right? And kind of ignore public affairs or science information altogether. And so we have this pick and choose culture. To exacerbate that, a lot of us go online for science and technology news, right? In 2016, the highest percentage ever of Americans went online for information about specific scientific issues. 67% of adult Americans went online, right? And so we're turning to the internet for information about science and technology. And what we see there is very different, right, from what we know of as traditional media. We have kind of a lot of cues that help us contextualize and make sense of information. We're all very used to seeing things and information and news on social media now, but what we, you know, kind of don't articulate to ourselves is the differences between this, the comments, the ability to comment in real time, the ability to like and share in real time. These are cues, right, that we as humans it helps us make sense of this information. Right? As an example, you can think of if you're on Facebook or something and you have a friend from high school or middle school that you haven't seen in a really long time, that maybe your views have diverged since you last, you know, hung out. Just by virtue of seeing something that they post, even if you never read that article, the person who has posted that contextualizes that information for you already. It helps you make sense of it in some way. So the third sort of line is that, you know, the nature of the scientific problems that we face and that face society are very different now. They're often very multidisciplinary, they're very complex, right? All these that are listed here require many fields to kind of do research and tackle. And so what happens is that the concerns, you know, they tend to outpace our capacity to address the ethical, legal, and social implications. And again, these implications have sort of results in how we fund and regulate science and society, right? Especially and all of this, of course, matters in democratic society. And so, you know, to kind of sum up why science communication, or to articulate why science communication is important, I think there have been a couple of nice articles in the sciences. So this came out in Science Magazine, right? Alan Leshner used to be the CEO of AAAS, and he's talking about the opinion gap in sciences needs not be allowed to swell into something that we cannot bridge. And since then, we've had sort of initiatives that think about more strategic ways to communicate science, right? So from the National Academy's report in 2017, thinking about science communication research that can be translated into practice. And the health sciences have been doing this for a very long time, right? Translational medicine, for example, has been doing this for a very long time. But in science communication, you know, doing the research that is realistic, that is pragmatic, that addresses the needs of people who are communicating science, right? These are all questions I think that are important. And then again, the sort of civic science imperative that we have to have some public input into this, right? The public has a role to play in how we think and talk about science. And so with that, I'm going to move on to giving you some examples of the type of research that I do, focusing specifically on emotion and humor. So to start with disgust, which this was really fun. So this came out of a collaboration with the American Society for Microbiology, and I happened to be at a Broader Impact Summit in Madison, actually. And I met the communications director, and we started talking, and she found out I was a microbial oceanographer, right? She's a microbiologist by training. And the microbiome at the time was becoming this very interesting, kind of like a buzzword in the microbial sciences, and they were really interested in what people thought about it. Because at the time, it was around 2015 when I met her. The idea of doing fecal microbiota transplants was really interesting to treat C. diff infections, right, Clostridium. But people were starting to do it at home, right? To take healthy stool samples and process it at home to put it into somebody who had an infection, right, to help treat someone who had an infection. And anyway, so the goal was to understand sort of how disgust, because it's, again, this idea of microbiomes generally tap into our feelings of disgust, how that changed our perceptions of risk when it came to modifying microbiomes, right? A lot of microbial therapies are around modification of sort of the microbiomes that you have. And you know, microbiomes, we all tend to think of microbiomes as, when we say that word, we think of the gut microbiome, right? And the Human Microbiome Initiative, that's certainly the most popular or well-known one, but microbiomes extend across the spectrum and across different contexts of science, right? So there's the Earth Microbiome Project, for example. A lot of people who think about bioremediation and treating soils are thinking about microbiomes. They're also in the oceans, right? Remediation in the oceans. There's a whole oceanomics project that has to do with characterizing microbiomes. And so, but their modification is really kind of what most people think about, right? And what is closest to us. So this is a figure of how this is done, right? And they do this in sterile conditions in a hospital where experts are doing this, but there's also this, right? And in fact, this is there are YouTube tutorials, and you can look this up, on how one prepares a stool sample for treatment of C. diff, right? And when you look at the comments, I think these are particularly illuminating, right? Especially the one on the bottom. And the particular video that is from is a mom treating her child. And so, you know, this is a thing that at least from the ASM's perspective, they were quite concerned that people would find this pretty gross, even though it is a therapy that is very helpful and very effective for treating C. diff. And that's the only thing that people would associate with the word microbiome is poop, right? And FMT. And in fact, media coverage does tend to emphasize that microbes are disgusting and gross, right? And we know from research that once an emotion is triggered by information, by news stories, we tend to feel that again, right? When we think about assessing future issues related to microbiomes or FMT, it's probably gonna be a little bit in the context of disgust or through a lens of this is kind of gross. Right? And so when we're thinking about experiencing disgust, emotions in general are more easily experienced when we can mentally find a mental image of that, right, and visualize that. And there's a lot of evolutionary origins of disgust that are related to microbiomes, so that's kind of a natural place for us to think about. And so what we wanted to do was look again at whether, when people find it disgusting, does that increase their perceptions of risk, right? So we were devising an experiment, and one of the things we thought, well, you know, if people can imagine, sort of create a mental image of it, and if it's focused on humans, it's much easier to create that mental image. And so we would expect, right, that if you were able, sort of, if it was focused on humans versus animals, you would certainly experience at least more disgust. The other thing, and this is for the theorists in the room, you know, we're thinking about the appraisal tendency framework and the sort of postulates of it, right? Emotions cause cognition, they guide our behavior, and then they're associated with specific appraisals, right, that are either kind of make us avoid a thing or approach a thing, right? So you can think of anger as kind of an approach emotion, you get angry, right? Fear is an avoidance emotion, and disgust is certainly an avoidance emotion. And so thinking about that, and when we think about risks, right? If we're more avoidant, if we feel disgust about a particular issue like microbiomes, chances are we might perceive more risk in that issue as well. And so what we ended up testing, right, was this model where we manipulated the language in a particular text about fecal microbiomes in FMT. We also looked at whether it was focused on, we changed whether it was focused on humans and animals, and we measured how much disgust they felt and then their perceived risks down the line. And so for the details, and again, the methodologists, we did a textual manipulation. So the manipulation was pretty subtle, right? It mentioned fecal matter or poop in some and not in others. We got a quota sample in Qualtrics, and then ran some regression models. Oh yeah, that's enough of that. But what we found was that, yes, indeed, if you have, first of all, we were able to induce disgust just with sort of a language manipulation, right? And as you'll see later, the levels of disgust aren't particularly high, which is not particularly surprising, because we're not using visuals, we're just using text, right? But that in turn caused people to sort of perceive more risks in the issue of microbiomes. So this was about, do you think modifying the microbiomes is risky? Right? And we came up with a lot of these measures in concert with, in collaboration and talking to the ASM folks, because this is kind of what they were interested in. But in addition, we can see that if it's focused on humans, right, and I'll show you a graph in a minute because this makes less sense. I just want to show you that this moderator, the moderation is significant, that if it's focused on humans, it definitely causes us to feel more disgust, right? And then in turn, and then we perceive more risks. And so what you'll see here is the language manipulation on the x-axis, the no disgust condition and the disgust condition, and then the experience disgust. And that's the whole scale, right? And so you see it in the non-human focus, and it was just about Vibrio. It was Vibrio bacteria and squid. But in the human focus condition, right, we managed to elicit more disgust, and that disgust is positively associated with people perceiving more risk. So that's kind of an example of the research that I've been doing with disgust and microbiomes, and that work is sort of ongoing and exploring more other emotions. In fact, in terms of emotions, Jess and I have a project that we've been working on that is pretty exciting, and I think fun. Maybe not so fun for the coders, but what I've spent most of my time on recently is studying humor. And part of that is because, I spent a lot of time writing the grant to get it, and then I got the grant, so now I have to do the thing, right? But before I talk about the research, I just wanted to show you some examples of humor in science communication. So these are a couple of hashtags that scientists are actually using, right, to bring some humor into their science. So this is Review for Science, and this is when scientists are reviewing things that they buy everyday purchases on Amazon, but for scientific purposes, right? So that's a really fun one. And actually, this whole study came out of the hashtag overly honest methods and seeing overly honest methods. And I'll show you a couple examples of that in a minute. This is a new one that I've seen recently, the hashtag fieldworkfail. And these are illustrations of actual scientists' tweets, right, of their experiences in the field. Which, like, having done field work, these are real things that happen, right? Like, my fieldwork fail was that my Boston whaler ran out of gas in the middle of the bay when I was sampling, and we had to wait 2 hours for somebody to bring us more fuel. And then overly honest methods, which is kind of the sort of impetus for all of this, even though I ended up sort of not using that hashtag for various reasons. And this is scientists tweeting about the methods that they use in very frank ways. These are the realities of doing science, right? Not everything goes in the idealized way that we learn in school. And so one of the other reasons why I was really interested in humor is that it's often sort of a recommended communication tactic, right? Use humor. But there's not a lot of evidence that it's effective, right? Or empirical evidence that it's effective in particular. And so I kind of wanted to see about that. I also wanted to know how much humor is out there, right? We have sort of these anecdotal examples of, yeah, scientists are using humor, but how much is really out there? And so we started with a content analysis, just thinking about how prevalent science humor is online, and then what types of humor are present. And then that led into actually running an experiment. So, okay, it's present, but what effect does it have on people's attitudes and how they feel about scientists? Right? Because one of the things I hear a lot from programs that are training scientists to be better communicators are, well, you know, you seem pretty not human, like not people-like, right? You're not very warm or you're not very likable. So part of this is, you know, scientists are people too. But so with the content analysis, what we did is we looked at Twitter and Instagram and we pulled publicly available tweets with a certain set of hashtags for a year. We came up with 110 of them. We ended up manually coding, but I'll talk about that in a minute. We coded like 1% of that sample. But here are the search terms. You don't have to read all of this, but the way I sort of broke it out was I had search terms and hashtags related to humor, and then I had hashtags related to science, and then I had hashtags that were a combination of science and humor, right? So trying to kind of pull all of that. We also wanted to include the hashtag STEAM, right? Because that's kind of a newer science, technology, engineering, art, and math is kind of a newer thing. But it turns out when you're on social media and you use the hashtag STEAM, you're talking about gaming. So that didn't work out. So then we manually coded them for things like relevance. Are they actually about science, right? How many likes do they have? How many retweets? How many reposts if it's on Instagram? And what are the types of humor? So we ended up coding about 1% of this, and it took us a long time to decide on how to code the types of humor and how to characterize the types of humor. And I'm just going to show some of the descriptive data from this in a minute, because one of my collaborators who's interested more in the social norms and the tweets and retweets and likes is kind of working on those data. But so the types of humor that we analyze, first of all, anthropomorphism. There's a lot of anthropomorphism in science humor, right? Giving human characteristics to organisms or inanimate objects. You've probably seen the selfie one too, where it's a cell taking a selfie, right? There's also a lot of wordplay. Selfie is another good example. And this particular joke formed the basis of our experiment. So we used this joke because this one has both wordplay and anthropomorphism, right? It has, the atoms have human characteristics and then it's a pun. We also characterize slapstick humor, so this idea of like explosive things, right? Clownish humor, where everything is exaggerated, features are exaggerated, so in this case, the hair, the lab coat. Parodies, that are parodies of popular culture. This is kind of a fun one that I like. And then satire and sarcasm, which a lot of the research in humor and political communication and some of Chris's work has done and looked at, right? So just to share some descriptive statistics, most of the posts were relevant to science. Sometimes you just get posts like this. True. Right? And you're not really sure why these hashtags are used, but this is what you get. And so, we had to kind of get rid of those. About a third of them were that way. Most of the posts that we collected were Twitter posts, right? And the number of followers, this was kind of pleasantly surprising for us, that the range of followers on the accounts was a wide range. And then looking at just the descriptives of the percentage, of the types of humor, and I'm showing you the 4 most prevalent ones on Twitter, and then again on Instagram. And so what you'll see in the experiment is that we use anthropomorphism and wordplay. So we didn't actually use satire and sarcasm. It's another one of my colleagues inconveniently wrote this paper about framing and functionally equivalent framing. And so we're thinking about how to make sort of the conditions as similar as possible. And when you have satire, it turns out that's very challenging, right? And so that's where we started, but we ended up taking a step back and thinking about how to make these sort of, in the framing literature, more functionally equivalent. Okay, okay. So then, taking sort of the experiment part of it, I started to realize that most of my research follows these, for the communication scholars in the room, right? These class 3 type research claims, right? Where you change the message, you vary the message, and then you measure some mediating state of that person, which is a psychological state, and it has some outcome, right? Some persuasive outcome that's kind of downstream or down the line. And, these are sort of the things I study right now, and then there's also the individual traits that moderate that, right? So what are the things about us? So not only is the context important, which is kind of the bottom line there, what's the message variation, right? But the life space, as it were, is also important, right? What our traits are. Okay, so what we did was we conducted a survey, we embedded the experiment. The experiment itself had 4 humor conditions. So it had a no humor condition, and then it had the anthropomorphism and wordplay, and then the combination of the 2. And the combination of the 2 is the original joke that you saw. And then what we measured is sort of whether they experienced humor, so that's a psychological intervening state. Their engagement intentions, were they likely to share, were they likely to, like the tweet, share it, put a comment. And then the trait, the individual trait that we measured is this idea of need for humor. And specifically, we measured internal need for humor, right? Do you need to be the person or the source of that funny message? So if we look at this in a model, it looks a little bit like this, right? So we expect that the humor manipulation will positively influence experience worth, we're assuming it's funny, that then influences their intention to engage positively, and that how you are, your inclination, right, to be the source of humor or not is going to kind of moderate that relationship. And so I'll show you the conditions. So this is the no humor condition. We took out all the anthropomorphism, we took out the wordplay, and in fact the hashtag here says science fact instead of science funny, which it is, right? This is the combined condition. So this is the other end of the spectrum, the original joke. And so here we have the anthropomorphism and we have the wordplay, and then the hashtags are changed. And then we have the comments on the bottom, and the comment just sort of was the same condition as the humor condition, right? So no humor in that one, and then we tried to sort of exacerbate the wordplay in the combined condition. And then we had the middle conditions. So anthropomorphism only, right? We took out the pun in it, or the play on words. And then the wordplay condition, we just took out the human characteristics and the atoms. And so the first thing that we did was like, well, do people actually find this funny, right? Because I guess a lot of science jokes are like dad jokes, I think. So, are they funny? Turns out, this turned out very nicely, actually. Aldrich does work. But so, right, the conditions, the no humor condition is sort of the lowest in mirth, and then the combined condition produced the most mirth. And the 2 in the middle were actually not significantly different, right? The level of humor that elicited was not significantly different. And so then we looked at that relationship that I showed you earlier, and it turns out like the humor does or mirth, this experienced psychological state that you have, is a significant mediator, but it's only a partial mediator, right? We still had a relationship between the actual conditions and people's intentions to engage, and this is really interesting to me because that relationship was actually negative. And so there's some residual effect, right, about that manipulation that is not captured by experienced mirth, that is negatively influencing people's intentions to engage with that post, which is sort of interesting. And I'm still kind of diving into that. But then, of course, we have this very positive relationship between, if you think it's funny, you're far more likely to share that. And that actually is moderated by how you feel, right? Or your trait, or your need for humor, kind of your need to be the source of that humor. And so coefficients for interactions never make sense to me. I just have to look at them in graphs. But here you're seeing experienced mirth, right? In the full scale of experienced humor, and then the intention to engage, again, the full scale there. And what you see is, right, as expected and as the data show, as you experience more mirth, you're more likely to sort of intend to share and engage with that Twitter conversation. And that actually just increases, right, the more you feel the need to be that source of humor. So those are some of the types of things that I've been thinking about recently. I really enjoy thinking about the humor. I didn't enjoy thinking about the types of humor when I had to articulate the content analysis, because as it turns out, trying to articulate types of humor makes it less funny. But so we're taking this work now, and that's a basic science joke, right? And so I'm really interested in sort of what it does when you put it into context of science that are relevant, right, that affect us. So climate change, for example. Turns out there's a communication researcher who's also a really great cartoonist, and he studies, he's been studying humor in comics for a while. John Cook, who's now at George Mason, was a cartoonist in a former life, and so he actually drew this for us, which is really nice. And he's working on the artificial intelligence and the microbiome's conditions as well. So these are actually mock-ups that my graduate student drew, which I'm really impressed by. But John is kind of going to make them look more professional. So we're going to repeat these with different types of humor, now thinking about satire and wordplay, for example, in the climate change condition, and different combinations of those. So I'm excited to get that going. Other future work, I mentioned, I think earlier, this study where Jess and I are working on. As it turns out, she has a whole bunch of the 700 Club stuff recorded and DVR'd, and so we're going to do something with that. But we're coding episodes of Your Questions and Honest Answers, which is a segment on the 700 Club. I'd never heard of the 700 Club before this, having grown up in a religious, not religious home. But we're going to start again with the content analysis, thinking about the prevalence of the questions related to health and science and environmental issues that come up in these segments, and thinking about the emotional appeals that are used. And then whether the solutions to these challenges are faith-based, are they scientific, right, medicine-based, are they aligned with what experts say? And then hopefully running a survey experiment, manipulating kind of the appeals to whether it's an appeal to faith in the solution, right, versus an appeal to science and medicine, and then this emotion of hope and inspiration. So we're kind of in the content analysis part of that. We spent a little bit of time thinking about the survey experiment. But so that's kind of where we're going. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about here is some of the challenges that I think science communication faces, and I think the knowledge deficit model is definitely one of those. So I'm trained in communication, but I used to be a scientist, right? And so I spent a lot of time talking and interacting with scientists. And in fact, I tend to go to a lot of science conferences. And when I sort of have conversations with scientists, quite often, and I've heard this from other researchers, science communication researchers in this space, that this idea of the deficit model is very alive. It's very alive, it's very well, and it's pretty insidious, I think. It still persists, right? And I think there's a couple, so the knowledge deficit model, first of all, is this idea that if you know science, right, if you know more about science, you will have better attitudes toward it. And when we say better, we really mean like attitudes that are more aligned with that of the experts, right? We think about climate change, for example. Like if you just knew more about climate change, well, obviously you believe that it's caused by humans, right? And it's predicated on this idea of science literacy. And again, it's very persistent. I was just recently at a conference in Honolulu, a STEM conference, diversity in STEM conference, and somebody had drawn this as we were talking about the knowledge deficit model. And I do think it's a pretty good description, right? This like zombie idea that keeps coming back. say that knowledge is not important. It certainly is important, as you know, as you can tell, even to get some of the science jokes, you have to have some level of knowledge about science, right? But it's sort of not the only thing that determines our attitudes and our opinions and our beliefs about science. And some reasons I think that this is so persistent is that as scientists, we're trained to be objective, right? We are trained to take in knowledge and revise our hypotheses based on knowledge, right? And it's sort of, well, yeah, and other people do that. I also think that our conceptualizations of the public as other is a little bit problematic, right? Because I know nothing about geothermal energy, for example. I am a member of the lay public when it comes to geothermal energy, right? And so I think as scientists, we are other in some contexts as well, in some disciplinary contexts. Like I'm an expert in my area, but in other areas I'm certainly not. Also, at institutions of higher education, this is a policy that works well. If there is a deficit of knowledge, we are institutions of knowledge. It's pretty easy to fill that deficit, I think. So I think that's one challenge that we still face in science communication and kind of, especially when it comes to talking with scientists about science communication and strategic ways of science communication. The other thing that we face is this idea of practice and research, that I think there's a little bit of a divide between the research that we do and the practice of science communication, right? The sort of theoretical questions that we ask versus the practical needs of people who are on the ground doing the communication of science. I think there's quite a disconnect there. That I know there are initiatives and sort of attempts to bridge that gap that are ongoing nationally. And it's really cool actually because a lot of this is coming from the sciences, right? The sciences are really interested in communication and they see very much a need for it. And the other thing I've been personally quite interested in is this idea of diversity in STEM. And I recently submitted another proposal thinking about how diverse sort of representations of scientists change. And I think science communication is a really important part of the diversity puzzle in STEM, right? Because we, as scientists, we can communicate about our science, but we can also communicate that we are human beings doing the science, right? And sort of show images of who we are as models, right? So I think it's a really good sort of space. Science communication has a role to play in sort of improving diversity in STEM. Right? And in fact, some people have studied this, right? Using like scientists who selfie or the various hashtags that are on. I'll leave this up for a minute. Right? Like women in science, scientists who selfie, and then also this is what a scientist looks like, for example. But thank you again for being here and taking time out of your evening. I really appreciate it, and then I'll take any questions. Questions? You can also email me or tweet at me.
All right, Chris.
Thanks for your talk, Sarah. That was great. I want to go back to your interesting finding about that negative path from your joke manipulation to intention when you put humor in the model or mirth in the model. And so, I mean, I don't know what other variables you have in those data, but I'm just thinking sort of off the top of my head about Navi's work on message discounting, that when we get a joke, we don't take it seriously. And so if you maybe like message discounting might be working against the humor, like the humor itself is really fun and interesting and it piques our interest, but at the same time, humor can downplay the seriousness of the issues. Maybe it's something like that, or maybe like perceived credibility. I wonder if like the humanity of the scientist is in tension with the credibility of the scientist. And if that, you might be seeing a downplay on perceptions of credibility.
Yeah, so I actually just recently ran another study with like a scientist who's doing stand-up comedy and measured the credibility.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it actually doesn't erode their credibility for them to kind of be talking about science, but in kind of a domain that's outside of science, right? right? Because they're now acting as a stand-up comic versus like an actual scientist. But it would be interesting to think about credibility, I think, in this study because, right, it's just the scientists sharing information on social media, for example. They're not actually in a different domain. They're still acting as an expert in science in this case, right? Yeah, I think about message discounting, I think the data shows, so the model that you saw is kind of a simplified version, right? Because that humor manipulation is nominal. And so in the process model, right, it's actually looking at each condition versus the other, right? Each experimental condition versus the other. And when you look at the combined condition, that negative relationship is actually not significant. And it's only significant in the other two. So I think it's something about that the joke isn't complete almost, right? That is creating that negative relationship, I think. I think it might be that without the other type of humor, like without the full joke, that's an even lamer joke, right? And so I wonder if that is maybe creating some backlash, because that wouldn't be captured by experienced mirth. You wouldn't think it was that funny. Right? That's kind of what I got, but I've been puzzling about that one actually.
I was curious your thoughts about how this scales, say from the scale of like emotional hooks and connections on the scale of like a tweet or an article versus sustained or sprinkled here and there about whether you front load it or try and use that to tie things up over, say, a semester course or something like that. So science communication or science instruction.
Yeah, I mean, certainly most of the work I do are these very short-term effects, and they're pretty subtle, right? None of the manipulations that, I can change are gonna make these like massive effects, right? This isn't, I'm never gonna get 99% of my variance explained, like physicists. In fact, when I get 30%, I'm like, yay! Yeah, so I don't know. The answer is I don't know about the long-term effects about this, right? Because I don't have any longitudinal data right now. But I think it would be a really good question to think about. What are the long-term effects, right? Either emotion or humor, right? And some of the question I think is about like what are the long-term effects on people's trust in science in general as an endeavor, and then also in scientists, right? I think like Chris was mentioning this idea of credibility, sometimes humor you could imagine that it might erode credibility. And the political communication literature, for example, it shows us that, for like satire especially, it can kind of erode trust, right, in political actors or political institutions. And the question, like overly honest methods is something that is satirical, right, that is sarcastic. And so does that, over time, right, erode people's trust in scientists and science? But then, of course, there's who's reading these overly honest methods tweets, right? Probably other scientists. Like, what proportion of the public, so this is another piece of the puzzle that we don't know about, what proportion of the public is actually seeing these tweets, right? We can say they're publicly available. I mean, that's what I'm gonna say in the paper when I justify my choice. But really, it's an open question, and it's empirical as to how many people are actually reading and seeing these things.
Thanks.
I have a question about the need for humor, that the personal trait, because I know the need for cognition, I know the sense of humor, but I'm just a little confused with this variable, like how do you conceptualize and operationalize?
Yeah, it's a validated scale that came out of Need for Levity, and it has two dimensions. It has internal and external need for humor, and it's very closely related with the sense of humor scale, like that multidimensional sense of humor scale that I think you're talking about. Yeah, and so when you look at the items, they're very similar. And actually, we pilot tested the items and kind of picked the ones that worked best, right, in our pilot. Yeah, but I'm happy to talk more about that too.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks. Talk was great. I wonder what your thoughts are about the potential use of humor in anti-science rhetoric. because it seems like to me that the other context of using humor as pro-science are things like even the Big Bang Theory, but also, like ridiculing of climate change in what maybe the right or those anti-climate change or anti-vax sees as kind of humorous or ridicule that are on the edge, right?
Yeah, and hopefully that sort of the next study that looks at climate change, and the climate change one in particular, I think we're gonna run a sub-study on misinformation. Partly because John is really interested in that too, and so, yeah, I'd be curious to see how that satire, and usually the type of humor that they use is satire or sarcasm, right? And stay tuned, I'll have an answer hopefully for you, but we haven't looked at satire and sarcasm yet because of that sort of functionally equivalent idea, right, of the conditions. So yeah, we're gonna feel that soon, I hope.
Okay, thank you.
Unrelated to science, do you use like your personal Twitter and Instagram to like gauge the interactions that you receive for like the funny science posts you make, or is it like a different account? Like which account do you use, and then also in order to actually measure, like to get like the ones that you had like a pretty large response rate to them, like thousands of likes, retweets, that type of thing. How do you build up that type of social media following for something like that?
So, hang on, caveat here is that even though I study social media, I don't actually use it that much, don't tell everyone. So those were actually just created. So I don't use my own social media account for that, but I just created those experimental manipulations. I just looked at Twitter and then kind of created that in Illustrator basically, right, to create the manipulations. And then in terms of the norms, sort of the retweets and the likes, we were also interested in how that affected our sample, right? And so we actually changed those. We had some that were really high and some conditions that were really high and conditions that were really low. Turns out people don't notice that as much. So it kind of has a competing effect with humor. So if you noticed it, right, that's actually what drove your intention to engage with the tweet. If you didn't notice it, then the humor was what kind of drove that. And so we took that just by looking, basically. We just looked at a bunch of tweets and looked at how many likes and retweets they had, and then came up with something that was, somewhat valid, because a lot of science tweets just don't get that much traction, right? So to put something like 10,000, even though it's high and it's good for the experimental part of it, right? It's good for the internal validity. It would have been terrible for the sort of external validity because it's just 10,000 people are not going to like a post or a joke about an atom, right? That's just not realistic.
You were talking about diversity in science and diversity. Can you talk a little bit about how can we solve that problem, especially for diversity in science communication and among science communicators?
Yeah, that is a challenge. I actually have this hypothesis that introducing more social science and more social science collaborations in the physical and life sciences has the added side effect, beneficial side effect of introducing more diversity. Because I think in the social sciences we're a little bit more diverse than in the physical or life sciences, right? And again, there's gradations of which sciences you're in. So if you're in physics and engineering, you're, probably have the least amount of diversity. But as you kind of move to the softer, the messier sciences, I think, right? Like the physicists think that ecologists are just messy science, right? But I think as you tend to move that way, you have a little bit more diversity. But yeah, it's a very challenging question to address. But so recently I went to a diversity in STEM conference, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in STEM. And they have just started a science communication professional development track, which I think is one way, right? And I actually met someone from Penn State who's in, I think, microbiology, studying microbiomes there. But I think that science communication is gaining traction in spaces like this is very beneficial for us, especially in terms of thinking about introducing more diversity into communication, into science communication, and then into STEM fields as well.
Sort of piggybacking off of that, do you think diversity in science communication is, or lack of diversity in science communication is driven by lack of diversity in the sciences? Or vice versa, or?
Yeah, I think it's a selection issue, right? In that, like, the lack of diversity in the sciences kind of drives, in some ways, it segregates who ends up in science communication as practitioners. Because a lot of science communicators I know are people who don't want to be in the lab anymore, don't want to, do that kind of research anymore, either because, for various reasons, right? And so I think there's this sort of tendency, right, that there's a bias already in who ends up the knowledge producers versus the knowledge disseminators. And, that I think is something that's really challenging because and I think if science communication and public engagement and public communication can gain more traction in terms of value, right, and incentives to do that more, then I think more of the people who drop out to do that might stay in the knowledge production areas. And so I think that would introduce more diversity, right, into STEM fields.
Okay, so one concern I have is that because of the structural barriers of who becomes the knowledge producers, that the more diverse people are the ones who decide to become science communicators.
Exactly.
And just sort
Yeah,
of
and so I think like the more that we can do in any of the sciences to value science communication, right, and to indicate that that is a valuable part and that is part of you as a scholar, right, that it is academic currency and not just publication. I think the more that happens, right, the more people are incentivized to stay in sort of the academic realm or the knowledge production realm. Other questions?
Thank you.